Hello everybody, welcome back. I hope you're all doing really well. This is a Polymath Bites episode about systemic sexism, and it's an episode that I'm making about episode 25, which talks about systemic discrimination in much more detail, with loads of psychology and sociology behind it. But that's a 3-hour video, and that's a really big commitment. Whereas I want to make a more casual, a more situationship-esque 20-minute video that's just more accessible. And I want to make this information accessible because it's really important. It's something that really affects people in society in so many ways, but in many ways which are unseen. And they're so unseen that you may not think that they exist at all, which is why I've titled this video, Is It Real? And I hope that if you're someone who doesn't believe that it is real, you've clicked on this video to, I guess, see what the other side is, to try and broaden your intellectual horizon, broaden the sort of arguments that you have at your disposal. And you can disagree with it. I'm not telling you what to think or how to think. I really don't want to do that, and I don't like doing that. But I think it's great to at least see other viewpoints and just at least try and hear some of the evidence for this, because there is a huge bulk of evidence for this. So first of all, when I say systemic sexism, first of all, I should say, I know that I seem very energetic, and I'm not on crack, I promise, and just, there's so much to talk about and in so little time. So you'll have to pardon my golden retriever-like enthusiasm. It's not enthusiasm for sexism, I promise. But anyway, systemic sexism is when it doesn't just exist inside the heads of random individuals on the street. Sexism, and this applies to any form of discrimination, by the way, it pervades society because it's entrenched in the institutions that comprise society. So any society is made up of lots of different structures. It's made up of its government, for example, things like a monarchy, its law courts, its police force, its universities, its educational system, its media, its tabloids, its radio stations, its TV shows, its filmmaking industry, its social media profile, all this kind of intangible fabric, these structures that make up society, all these things are ultimately made of individuals. And if these individuals carry sexist attitudes, even if they're not consciously carrying those sexist attitudes, and we're gonna get more on that later, so don't worry, then that means that these institutions serve to propagate that through society, and they reinforce that through society. Because remember, an institution in society is just made up of people. So sexism becomes systemic. It pervades society as a whole when the levers of power in that society, when the structures of that society become themselves pervaded with that attitude. So a really great piece of empirical evidence to start this off with is a study done by Moss Rakusin and his team in 2012. This study, where they took a bunch of male and female American university professors and they sent them fake CVs. And they gave these CVs, these identical CVs, either a male name or a female name. And they found that male and female teachers, these male and female university teachers, so these educated, presumably left-leaning, we can't make an firm assumption on that, but there are correlations there. University professors they gave CVs with female names. They said that they would be less likely to give them a job. They would be less likely they'd be less likely to give them a job. They rated them as less competent. They said that they would give them a lower starting salary, and they said that they would give them less mentoring. And so they thought that these were real applicants. And the only thing that was different between these CVs was just a male and a female name. And simply the knowledge that the CV came from a woman led to female university staff saying all these things and making all these judgments. So this wasn't a form of conscious bias, clearly. Clearly, these female university professors don't want to think of female students as less competent and less deserving of being hired. But what that speaks to is a sort of unconscious decision-making. It speaks to a lower level of cognition informed by all the information and the beliefs and the norms of the society that we live in. And remember, what's really important to note is that most decision-making is unconscious. So you may have heard of the book Thinking Fast and Slow, for example. So Daniel Kahneman, who won a Nobel Prize, by the way, Amos Tversky, essentially did a huge amount of work in showing that human cognition was not rational, and in fact was subject to huge numbers of cognitive shortcuts called heuristics. All these things such as biases, these different psychological effects. And what happens is the information that we're inundated with in society leads us to make unconscious judgments about things. And in a sort of, like, imagine a brain is a filing cabinet. For each different thing, each different concept, for example, the concept of a man or a concept of a woman, in people's kind of mental filing cabinets, they have different files on these things. And these files are called schemas. And these schemas, they can be consciously examined, but they're formed unconsciously. That's the key point here to make. So the point is that these female university staff rated female CVs as less competent because of this schema that they had about females, because that's the only varying factor here. And this whole episode 25 and this whole episode really seeks to examine why has this schema formed simply as a process of these women existing in a society about what it means to be a woman. So this is when we bring in social identity theory. So everyone knows that really men have ruled the world since the beginning of state societies, and that's only changed in the 20th century. People know that men were always the ones with executive power, but actually it's way more than that, because men were the ones administering society. They were the bureaucrats, they were the civil servants. Men were the soldiers, men were the commanders. So males were the ones who ultimately held power over the outcomes in a society. And of course, that's not to say that all men operate as a united front. I mean, classism, slavery, feudalism, all of these factors clearly indicate that men is not a united force. But the point is that all these individuals and institutions which have held military power have been men. But it's more than that. All the artists have been men, all the scientists have been men, all the philosophers, all the writers, all the intellectuals, all the scholars. Education itself was limited to men almost exclusively until around about the 20th century. And even then, that was in the West. There's still progress being made in other parts of the world. And also work. The fact that women only started to work in like the late 1900s. Working, i.e. going out and contributing to society, it's a way of participating in the society that you live in. Whereas domestic work essentially cuts you off from making sort of social and intellectual contributions to society. And this is basically means that throughout history, men had the complete freedom to create the societal norms about what maleness and femaleness are. So these sort of schema that we talk about man and women, these are informed, these kind of perceptions that we form around what it means to be a man and woman are informed by the norms of the society that we live in. And these norms have been formulated throughout history by male actors. So what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? What do they do? What's their role? Men had the freedom to determine all of these things. And as you can imagine, because all in any kind of psychological group will seek aggrandizement of their own group. They seek to promote their own group. They seek to derive self-esteem through having a group associated with positive characteristics. So traditionally, and if you look at the connotations of maleness in society, it's associated with action. It's associated with assertiveness, with rationality, with independence, with capability, with being educated. And these connotations crop up in all kinds of things. In literature, in media, so in all kinds of media. Films, novels, scientific treatises, radio broadcasts, TV shows, newspapers, poems, all these things, all these kind of methods of information transfer are permeated with these connotations of what maleness is. And femaleness in contrast. So in social identity theory, when we have a social groups seek optimal distinctiveness. Well, that means that if you have a social psychological group, such as men, they seek to elevate themselves above other psychological groups as much as possible, which means that it's not, because they had the freedom to do this, the consequences of males setting norms in societies was not just to elevate the psychological group of being a man and what it means to be a man, it was to lower and denigrate what it meant to be a woman. Femininity observed as a foil to masculinity. To use the terms of Simone de Beauvoir, it emerged as a second sex, to be understood as a counterpart, a lesser counterpart to the male sex. And again, if that doesn't sound super convincing to you, please watch episodes 24 and 25, because they talk about the vast bulk of evidence behind these psychological principles. Behind these psychological principles and how they all unfold. I just don't have time to tap into that huge iceberg of evidence here. But this isn't just conjecture. We know that this is how social groups operated. There are studies showing that if groups have the ability to do this, they will do this. So femininity became associated with passivity, with irrationality, with being emotional or hysterical, or too touchy-feely, with being submissive, with being dependent, with being incapable, with being uneducated. And all these things, this was possible because women, for the vast majority of human history, up until the 20th century in the West, to the beginning of states in the 4th millennium BCE, had no role in the formulation of any of these roles. Another thing, any kind of social group seeks something called prototypicality. So what they want to do, what an individual wants to do, is they want to align their own characteristics with the ideal characteristics of their group. So for example, let's say you play like a band. A prototypical band player is one who's really productive, really practical, shows up on time, always practices, etc., etc., etc. And individuals seek to align themselves with that group. But in the context of gender, men and women both belong to the superordinate category of being a human being. But men have had the power to determine what it means to be a human and determine what it means to be a man. So it helps them bring about this feeling of prototypicality, which makes human beings feel good. Humans seek out prototypicality, and they've had the power to do that. So just as maleness has been defined by assertiveness and rationality and action, what it means to be a human being, what is thought to distinguish human beings from animals, is defined in terms of rationality and assertiveness and power and dominion over nature. And of course, with the whole rationality thing, there are obviously biological bases for that. But the fact that that rationality is then aligned with conceptions of maleness, but not conceptions of femaleness, indicate that this conception of what it means to be a human being isn't just coming from biological concerns, it's coming from that psychological motive of prototypicality. And again, men or women or people aren't consciously aware of this. These are all principles, these principles of optimal distinctiveness and prototypicality. They work unconsciously. These are psychological forces which we are subject to without realizing consciously that we are subject to, which is why you need to learn about it in a psychology class. You're not born understanding that different groups seek to do this. And people often rationalize this kind of behavior. So for example, in the 1800s, there was a huge wave of pseudoscience trying to prove that women were somehow less rational than men, less intelligent than men. All of that was done with the goal of proving it though. It wasn't legitimate science designed to uncover legitimate sex differences in intelligence. By the way, there are no legitimate sex differences in intelligence, in terms of overall intelligence. Different genders do show differences in specific kinds of intelligence, but overall, in terms of actual rationality, there's no real difference. You could in fact argue that testosterone, because of its known effects on distorting behavior, because testosterone motivates certain forms of behavior, which I talk about in episode 13. If you define rationality as the capacity to make conscious decisions unimpeded by unconscious biases caused by hormonal activity, the case is just as strong for either gender to be the irrational one. The point is, all these norms are formulated according to psychological principles of group theory and optimal distinctiveness, not actual scientific work. Another final thing, the norms about women, the norms which permeate society on what determines a woman's worth, was set by men. So there's a huge emphasis on society on women being attractive and not being promiscuous. So essentially, you have these kind of dual conceptions of value as a woman, where huge pressure is placed on women in society to both be attractive and to discourage promiscuity and to be chaste. That makes complete sense if these norms and these pressures are formulated by men, because the idea is it's a value system wherein a woman's value is computed as being a sexual possession, i.e. as being sexually attractive, but also possessible and exclusive and not promiscuous. And this is the exact kind of thing you predict. Game theory even would predict this. If you have a group of people who have a monopoly to determine power over norms, they would create norms in society which suited their own reproductive interests. I actually talk more about the reproductive interests of men and women, and my men tend to go for quantity over quality and women the other way around, in episode 6 about the science of attractiveness, so please go and check that out if you're interested. I just don't have time to talk about all the evidence there. So just some examples of this: massive societal obsessions with looks, a huge makeup industry, media in terms of movies and TV shows and books and social media, all telling women that they have to be pretty and all presenting women. So if you look at like shows from just the 1900s or even like the 2000s or 2010s, the heroine is always attractive, but it's also like that attractiveness is explicitly mentioned. Like, it's really interesting once you look at these movies, old movies, just through the light of all this knowledge, because you really do see it play out. You see this norm of a woman's value being computed in terms of her attractiveness all the time. Also, the fact that songs, when you look at songs, for example, when you look at rap songs, men make those songs judge the worth of a man by being cool or having social status and doing things, and they judge the worth of a woman on being pretty. Because in these songs, for example, rap songs, pop songs, but also, as I mentioned, in any kinds of media, the way to denigrate a woman in these is by calling them ugly. It's by insulting their looks. You see this on a daily basis. If you go out on the streets at night, when a man is being... I was about to swear. I'm trying to tell myself I shouldn't swear in these videos. When a man is behaving poorly to a woman and deciding to insult a woman, almost the instinct that they go to is to insult her looks. Because the norms of a society have computed her value in terms of looks. So when individuals search for an insult, they search to do so on a way that denigrates someone's worth the most. But computations on what determines someone's worth is based on society. And that is how that's been decided in society. You also see a massive makeup industry for women, but not so much for men. And you also see in female adolescents, for example, much greater insecurity and concern with looks. Now again, you could chalk that just down to shallowness and obsessiveness, but that seems to me to be very surface level. You could say, women are just more shy than men. Women are just more into their looks than men. But why? And that's the point. Even if you don't believe in any of the stuff, even if you think I'm just clutching at straws and trying to push an agenda, I just want you to think why. Just try and question these things, which I think are important to be questioned and which underlie our society. Another thing, in terms of promiscuity, slut shaming is a thing. Slut shaming has always been a thing. And it's still a massively prevalent thing. The idea of slut shaming, the idea of shaming a woman for being promiscuous, as if it's some kind of moral ill, if you actually think about that, that doesn't really make sense from a moral decision-making kind of perspective. Because that's not harming anyone. As long as these decisions on female promiscuity are consensual and non-coercive, there's no reason why a woman being promiscuous has to be actually bad. But yet it's accepted almost as unconscious fact that it is bad by huge swathes of people by both genders. And that would be explainable by what I've just mentioned. Another thing, also, the vast majority of major religions, for example, the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, they mention chastity, of course, as a virtue, but they emphasize it way more for women than for men. The fact that a device like a chastity belt should even exist, some sort of metal, medieval-esque advice for literally preventing women from having reproductive freedom. The fact that that exists for women but not really for men is very telling. And yes, that's a historical example that most people would say is now barbaric, but the norms behind that, the psychological impetus behind that hasn't actually gone away. And nowadays, of course, women do have positions of power and influence, and they are writers and they are scholars. But we as a society are subject to all these norms that have built up over history and over generations. To use the phrase of political philosopher Leonard Woolf, we are subject to the dead hand of history. These norms have had millennia to develop and they stick. Because that's the thing, they're norms, they're entrenched in society. It requires a conscious awareness of them and deliberate refutation of them in order to get rid of them. But that's really difficult to do because they're norms in society, because they form part of the status quo, many people instinctively defend them because people don't like change and norms are what they know. And to consciously question the norms that you know takes knowledge and it takes insight and it takes introspection and it's uncomfortable, it's difficult. Hence why it's really hard to do. And it's changing now. And for example, there's a really famous feminist book published called Women Don't Owe You Pretty. But loads of feminist media published nowadays, even the Barbie movie, face huge amounts of backlash because trying to challenge the norms of a society is inherently challenging. People will push back against you. And in fact, human history proves that conclusion many times over. An important point is that legal change, i.e. giving women civil rights, which was only 60 or so years ago, by the way, is not the same as cultural change. Women in the West, for example, not outside the West, especially in the Middle East, and I've actually talked more about that on my channel, I got interviewed about that. Cultural equality, so women may be legally equal to men, but they're not seen as culturally equal to men. And an example of that is how when women submitted their CVs, even female university staff rated them as less competent. But all these norms, all these connotations on maleness and femaleness, these schemas on maleness and femaleness still persist. The cultural equality of women, i.e. the alignment of all the positive values of the male schema, sort of the application of these positive values to the female schema as well, hasn't come to fruition. And the modern movement of feminism, what modern feminism is, so third wave or fourth wave, depending on what you want to call it, is ultimately a social movement that just seeks that. And it's a movement which is massively misrepresented and which is massively demonized, but it's demonized because of course any kind of movement which seeks to change cultural norms is going to be demonized and hated and attacked, because instinctively, on a gut level, people do not like norms being challenged, and they can rationalize that by calling feminists misandrists and man-haters. Perhaps some third-wave feminists are legitimately misandrist, but modern feminism as a movement isn't about that. For example, calling Barbie, for example, a misandrist movie. I don't know if you've seen Barbie. The deuteragonist is a man. The film centers around the deuteragonist Ken struggles with being a man. It's the opposite of a misandrist film, but it's still attacked as being a misandrist film, not because the people who attack it, for example, Piers Morgan made that criticism, but he's just an example. It's not because a unbiased, disinterested observer would conclude that it's a misandrist film. It's because it's a film which is trying to tackle and challenge cultural norms, and people instinctively don't like that, but it's really hard to articulate that and put into words. So human irrationality being what it is, which I explore massively throughout my whole channel, especially in episode 15, it seeks a rationalization of that. Hence the narrative that these films are misandrist, because it's easier to say that than to say, oh, I actually don't like systemic challenges to the norms that I'm used to and that I've grown up with. So, that's a 21-minute video. I'm slightly over the 20-minute mark, so I'm just going to end this here. I hope that's been useful. Please go and watch the full video if you have the time or the inclination, especially if you're not convinced by what I'm saying, because what I'm saying, I don't have time to get into all the evidence. I'm giving you the theoretical argument and the rationale without the huge bulk of evidence behind it. So I really encourage you to go and watch episode 25 of Polymath. Even if it doesn't convince you, I still think it's just good to expose yourself to other views and to just see what the other side is saying, because it's not just that they're crazy or that they're insane. That's another misrepresentation. Think about that. It's not going to be the case that all the people who talk about systemic sexism are just stupid and misinformed. There may be something behind it. You may disagree with that. You may not think there's something behind it, but go and find out. You're a thinking human. Go do it. Go and find this stuff out for yourself and go actually see what's going on. That's what I'm encouraging. So anyway, thank you very much for listening, and I hope you guys all have a lovely day. Take care and goodbye.